The Library of Alexandria wasn't destroyed in a single fire. That's not what happened. The real story is more complicated, and it's a darker one. Its loss was a catastrophe. Carl Sagan, the astronomer, called it a devastating blow to human progress, an echo we can still hear. So what happened? It was political ambition. It was religious change, and it was neglect, just simple neglect. These forces worked across centuries. They dissolved a global archive. Was it one dramatic blaze? Or was it a slow death, a death by 1,000 cuts? This journey shows how a civilization can forget itself. It makes you wonder, what's the greatest threat to our memory now? To all we try to keep, you have to start with the ambition, the scale of it. After Alexander, the world just got bigger. New ideas, new gods, new philosophies, all of it flowing into the Mediterranean. And one general who ended up with a piece of this new world decided he was going to catch all of that in one place. That place was and at its center, the library. Ptolemy I looked at Alexandria, this city of marble and markets, and he saw something else, a city of the mind. He wanted it to be the intellectual capital, which meant he needed to have all the knowledge, so he started this project, the first real state-sponsored search for information. He sent agents out, to Athens, to Rhodes, too, with unlimited money. Their orders were simple: buy every book in the world. But it wasn't fast enough. The scrolls came in slowly. The Ptolemies wanted it now, so they changed tactics. They got aggressive. Every ship that came into the harbor, officials would board it. They weren't looking for cargo, they were looking for books. Any scroll they found, they took it straight to the library scribes. They'd keep the original, make a copy right there. Give the copy back to the captain. So you're a traitor, and they take your personal copy of a play or a medical text and hand you back a duplicate. It was like intellectual eminent domain. To them, it wasn't theft. It was a duty, a higher cause. The goal was total completeness. Every work, every history, poem, scientific observation, from every culture they knew. Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Babylonian, Hebrew. This library was meant to be a backup for civilization itself. At its peak, they think it held 400,000 scrolls, maybe more. It was the ancient internet. One physical place where you could, in theory, find everything. That was the vision. A treasure built on purpose by relentless royal design. And that design, it makes the disappearance later so much harder to grasp. When something built for permanence starts to fall apart. But this idea needed a place. A real place to match the scale of the thought. The library wasn't just a room for scrolls. It was a whole campus, an ancient university. You'd be in the royal quarter of Alexandria, walking past marble palaces, government buildings, and you'd enter this complex called the Shrine to the Muses, and the buildings themselves were a kind of argument. Grand colonnades gave shade for debates while you walked. Big lecture halls full of discussions on geometry, on poetry. There were gardens for thinking, even a shared dining hall, where scholars from all over ate together. Arguing, sharing, building on what the other person knew, that was the real invention. The library was a machine for thinking, and the most important part of that machine was the scrolls. Hundreds of thousands of them, papyrus rolls and later parchment, each one stored carefully, not just in piles but organized, put in labeled niches on shelves, with a tag saying what was inside. That seems obvious now, but then it was revolutionary. To have a collection that huge and to actually find something in it. A scholar, Callimachus, he went further. He made a master list of everything the library had. He called it the tablets. It was more than an inventory. It was the first library database. It organized works by author, by subject. Philosophy, history, medicine, drama. You could look up a topic and find every scroll the library had on it. So a doctor could cross-reference a Greek medical text with an Egyptian one. An astronomer could check observations from Babylon against his own. For the first time, knowledge became searchable, comparable. So the loss we're talking about isn't just paper burning, it's the collapse of a whole system. A dedicated environment built for one purpose, to connect ideas, to force one genius into conversation with another. A poet might overhear a mathematician's problem. A doctor could challenge a philosopher's idea about the human body. That synergy, that friction, it was by design. The architecture, the catalog, the communal life. All of it worked together to speed up discovery. When that ecosystem disappeared, something unique went with it. A way of working the world wouldn't really get back for more than 1,000 years. So the question is, what does it take to break a world built that carefully 400,000 scrolls? It's a number, but it feels hollow. To really feel what that means, you have to picture you have to see the titles on the shelves. It was a living record of human thought, so start with the stories. The complete works of the Greek playwrights were there: Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, not just the few plays that survived by chance somewhere else. Dozens of their works gone. Their comedies, their tragedies, entire kinds of storytelling we'll never get back. Then the scientists. Original texts by Aristarchus of Samos, who argued the earth went around the sun. His models, his calculations lost. We only know he had the idea because other writers mentioned him much later. His proof is gone. The medical works of Herophilus, who mapped human anatomy through careful study, his drawings, his observations vanished. Euclid's own handwritten proofs were there, but so much more was with them. Think of the historians, chronicles from across the known world. First-hand accounts of Persian kings, Phoenician voyages, Egyptian pharaohs, written by their own scholars, not their enemies. Those are gone. And here's the crucial part. The library wasn't just a Greek collection. It was a global archive by ancient standards. It held the Septuagint, the first major Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It collected works from Persian astronomers, Indian mathematicians, Babylonian philosophers. Each scroll was a unique perspective, a different way of seeing the stars, the body, the gods, reality itself. So the loss wasn't just quantitative. It wasn't just a lot of old paper burning. It was a qualitative erasure. We didn't just lose books. We lost entire schools of thought. We lost potential paths. What if a Babylonian medical text had survived to influence a Roman doctor? What if an Indian math treatise had reached a scholar in Constantinople? Those connections were cut. Each lost scroll is a missing piece in a puzzle we can only guess at now. The catastrophe was a silent, multicultural collapse. It didn't just set back one civilization. It narrowed the whole channel of human understanding for centuries. And that narrowing started not with a bang, but with a slow, political unraveling. Julius Caesar was in Alexandria. This was 48 years before the Common Era. He was chasing Pompey, and then the city turned on him. Forces loyal to the boy king, Ptolemy XIII, had him surrounded in the palace district. He was trapped there with the harbor at his back. His solution was tactical. To stop the enemy fleet, he ordered his own ships burned. Burn the docks, burn the warships. But fire in a city like that, built of wood and papyrus, it doesn't stay put. The wind took embers from the ships to the shore. They landed on the waterfront warehouses. And some of those warehouses, according to later historians like Plutarch and Seneca, held books, scrolls. A large secondary collection, some called it a daughter library, it went up in smoke. This is where the story often starts, the burning of the library, but the reality is murkier. The main library, though, was inland, away from the docks, so this fire probably didn't destroy that, but a major store of scrolls was likely lost. The confusion starts with Caesar himself. In his own account of the war, he writes about the fighting, the fire in the harbor. He never mentions a library, not a word. It's a glaring omission. Was it an accident he didn't want to admit? Or was it just collateral damage, not worth noting to a military mind? That's the first major blow, and it sets a pattern. The loss isn't the center of the story for the people causing it. The scrolls weren't the target, they were just in the way. That fire in 48, it's a symbol. The treasures of peace become the kindling of war. A general makes a calculation to save his army, and in doing so he sets light to centuries of thought. Those flames were an accident of history, but they were ignited by conflict, by ambition. And after a shock like that, a place built for permanence is never quite the same. It becomes vulnerable. The next threats wouldn't come from outside, they'd come from within. The fire was a wound, but the infection was the neglect that came after. The world's center shifted with Rome. Alexandria wasn't the capital of an ambitious Greek kingdom anymore. It was a province in a vast empire, and empires have different priorities. Some Roman emperors like Augustus saw the library's value. They kept it going as a symbol, but it wasn't a king's pet project to outshine Athens. It became a line in a budget. And when budgets get tight, cultural institutions are often the first to go. The money for the scholars, for the scribes copying decaying scrolls, that funding dried up. The great thinker-scientists, their stipends shrank or vanished. The campus grew quieter. A scroll was a fragile thing. Papyrus decays, ink fades, pests eat at the edges. The only way to preserve a text for centuries was to copy it by hand onto fresh material before the old one crumbled. That was a continuous, labor-intensive process. It required a funded system of scribes and librarians who saw that work as sacred. When the funding stopped, the copying stopped. And when the copying stopped, knowledge began a slow, silent fade. It wasn't burned. it just expired. One scroll at a time, a treatise on engineering would become too brittle to unroll. A collection of poems eaten by worms. A unique historical account would turn to dust on its shelf, with no duplicate made to carry its story forward. This was compounded by a diffusion. Other cities rose as centers of learning. Pergamum built a rival library so impressive the Ptolemies allegedly cut off papyrus exports to them. That led to more use of parchment. Rome itself became a magnet for scholars and patrons. The monopoly was broken. The best minds and the resources to support them were no longer all flowing to one repository in Egypt. That was progress in a way, a decentralization of knowledge. But for the Library of Alexandria, it was a slow drain. Its unique role as the one place that held everything was eroding. So the catastrophe continued, not with soldiers and torches, but with accountants and shifting calendars. Death by 1,000 administrative cuts. A decision here to reduce a scribe's pay. A decision there to fund a new temple in Rome instead of maintaining a storage room in Alexandria. It teaches a subtle, terrifying lesson. The greatest threat to a repository of knowledge is rarely a single enemy. It's the quiet assumption that someone else will take care of it tomorrow. It's the reallocation of attention, the slow withdrawal of care. The scrolls didn't scream as they turned to dust, they just ceased to be. And with them, voices from the past fell silent forever, not from malice. From simple, mundane neglect, Alexandria changed in the 4th century. The air was different. A new faith had arrived, Christianity, and it moved from the edges to the center of power. The old gods of the were seen by many as demons. The philosophical debates in the lecture halls started to sound like heresy, dangerous. This was more than a religious change. It was a reordering of knowledge itself. Truth wasn't something to question through reason anymore. For the new authorities, truth was something to be received, defined, and defended. The library's collection was full of pagan philosophy. Science based on observation, not scripture, poetry for different gods. All of it was in a precarious space. It wasn't necessarily marked for burning, but its value was in doubt, serious doubt. Why preserve the arguments of a discredited past? They could lead people astray. The tolerance that built the library was evaporating, replaced by a need for clarity, doctrinal clarity. In that atmosphere, preservation becomes a low priority. Funding dries up. A scroll isn't a treasure. It's a potential problem. Neglect now had an ideological justification. This transformation has a face. Hypatia, she was a mathematician, an astronomer, a philosopher, the last head of the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria, a brilliant public thinker. Students came from across the empire. She represented the old ideal, the classical scholar, the heir to the library's spirit. And in 415 she was attacked. A mob, inflamed by tensions, pulled her from her chariot. It was a public spectacle, horrific. Her death was more than the loss of one life. It was a signal, a brutal, clear signal. The old world of secular scholarship, of reason apart from faith, was no longer safe. The city that nurtured great minds turned on one of its own. After Hypatia, the scholars who remained understood. The environment for free inquiry was poisoned. The ecosystem the library needed was gone. But this isn't a simple story of religion versus science. Many early Christian scholars valued classical learning. The conflict was more nuanced. It was between a rising orthodoxy, seeking a single truth, and an older tradition that celebrated questioning. Multiple perspectives. Certain factions in the powerful church saw pagan texts as dangerous, actively dangerous. A theological argument in a scroll could undermine a sermon. A scientific observation could challenge scripture. So there's no record of a bishop ordering the library burned. But the social permission to care for the texts vanished. A text by Aristotle or Plato wasn't burned by decree. It was more likely left in a damp cellar, by a custodian who no longer believed it had worth, or who was afraid of being associated with it. The loss became passive, sanctioned by the spirit of the age. That's the insidious form of catastrophe, not a fire but a frost, a cultural climate that freezes the will to preserve. When a society decides certain ideas are illegitimate, the archives holding them become obsolete. They are not defended, not they are allowed to decay. Their dissolution is met with silence or quiet approval. The library, already weakened by neglect, now faced a world philosophically hostile to its reason for being. Its final silence wasn't just physical, it was intellectual. The conversation was over. 391. That was the year the state stepped in. Emperor I, he issued an edict, a series of edicts. They outlawed pagan rites across the whole Roman Empire. They ordered the destruction of the temple, so it wasn't just mobs anymore. This was official policy, Rome's policy, and in Alexandria that policy had a target. The Grand Temple of Serapeum, a hybrid god, Greek and Egyptian, a center of worship, and for centuries a center of learning. Many think it held a significant collection of scrolls, a secondary library. Some call it the daughter library. It was where the old knowledge lasted even as the main faded. There was more than a building. It was the last great symbol, the symbol of the old intellectual order in the city. When the edict came, the Patriarch of Alexandria saw his chance. He led a Christian mob to the temple. They didn't just close it, they destroyed it, tore it down stone by stone, smashed the statues. Any scrolls left inside would have been burned, torn apart, scattered and lost. The act was a public spectacle, a demonstration of power. The message echoed across the Mediterranean. The old world wasn't just fading, it was being dismantled by law and by force. Now by this time the great library of the was likely a shadow. Its glory days were long past, but this destruction is the crucial point. It was the final state-sanctioned blow, the blow to the whole framework, the framework that had created the library, sustained it for over 600 years. The physical loss was immense, possibly. Any surviving texts there gone, but the symbolic loss was absolute. This was the legal and religious pivot, political authority legislating the end, declaring a whole category of thought illegal, not just obsolete, illegal, history, philosophy. When you make it a crime to maintain a temple, you make it a crime to maintain the archive inside. The custodians flee, the protectors vanish. The chain of care is broken by decree, so the catastrophe was complete. It had moved through phases, from the ambition that built it, to the accidental fire of war, to the slow death of neglect, to the ideological hostility that froze its spirit, and it ended here. With the cold machinery of law and the hot fervor of a mob converging on one last temple, the framework was gone. The legal protection was gone. All that was left were the scrolls, scattered, hidden, decaying in cellars or private collections, vulnerable to the final, mundane disaster still to come. 642. That's the year the story says it ended. An Arab army under General Alaz took Alexandria, and a legend started, a legend that would last 1,000 years. It says the general found the great library still full of scrolls. He didn't know what to do, so he wrote to the Caliph for orders. The Caliph's reply was stark. He reportedly said if these books agree with they're not needed. If they disagree, they're harmful. Either way, they should be destroyed. So the legend ends with the scrolls being used as fuel for the city's bathhouses. It took 6 months to burn them all. It's a powerful story, a clean villain, a decisive ending, and for a long time that was accepted as the final chapter. But history isn't usually that neat. Most scholars now see this story as a myth, a fabrication that appeared centuries later. The earliest written account we have doesn't come from the 7th century, it comes from the 13th. 600 years after it supposedly happened. It was written by a Syrian Christian scholar, and in that gap the story grew. Why invent it so much later? The answer is in the politics of memory. By the 13th century, the Crusades had reshaped everything. Conflict between Christian Europe and the Islamic world was the defining story. The tale of Caliph burning the library became a perfect parable. It framed the loss of classical knowledge not as a complex internal failure of the Roman and Christian world, but as a simple act of barbarism by an outside force. It shifted the blame, completely. It turned a slow catastrophe of decay into a crime of conquest. This was convenient for writers in medieval Europe. It a messy history. It created a clear story about us versus them and who guarded civilization. But the reality on the ground in 642 was almost certainly different. By the time generals' forces entered Alexandria, the great library of the had been gone for centuries. Its physical structure was likely ruins used for other things. There was a memory. Any scrolls that hadn't already crumbled to dust or been lost in fires were scattered in private collections or stored in forgotten church basements. There was no single, vast repository left to burn. The library as an institution, as a living center of learning, had stopped functioning long before. So the myth isn't history, but it's incredibly important. It shows how the story of a loss can be weaponized, how later generations shape the past to fit their own conflicts. The real tragedy of Alexandria wasn't a single fire, it was a slow dimming. To blame one caliph is to miss the deeper, more unsettling lesson. Civilizations don't usually lose their memory in a dramatic raid. They lose it through a long series of small choices. Choices to not fund a scribe, to not copy a crumbling text, to see old ideas as threats instead of treasures. The myth of lets the earlier centuries off the hook. It provides a simple villain for a complex crime, and in doing that, it risks letting us make the same mistakes. If we believe knowledge is only destroyed by barbarians at the gates, we miss the quiet, daily neglect that happens all the time, and that's far more dangerous. The library didn't end in a single moment. It was a process. A combination of disasters working together, that's the important part. It wasn't one big fire like in the movies where everything is gone by sunrise. It was more like a break that happened in pieces. Each piece made the next one possible. First, there was the accident of Caesar's fire. Then came the slow neglect from Rome. The money dried up, the scribes weren't paid anymore. After that, the religious climate changed. Preserving the old texts started to seem questionable. Then the state tore down that last great temple of knowledge. And finally, the city itself was absorbed into other empires. Its history wasn't a priority anymore. These weren't different events. They were all part of the same story. The fire created an opening. Neglect moved into that opening. The new ideology made the neglect acceptable, and political power finished it with those final symbolic acts. They all fed into each other. No political will meant no funds for scribes. No scribes meant the scrolls just crumbled. Crumbling scrolls meant empty shelves. Empty shelves made the whole place seem unnecessary, which made people even less willing to save it. It was a cycle, a reinforcing loop. This idea of a compounding catastrophe, it changes how you look at loss in history. It stops you from looking for one simple villain. We want a clear enemy, a Caesar or a Caliph or an angry crowd. It makes the story neat. But reality isn't neat. The library didn't die just from malice. It died from 1,000 small decisions to look away. It died from violence, but also from starvation. A starvation of money, of focus, of simple care. Seeing that is sobering, because it means the biggest dangers to memory are usually the quiet ones. It's not the invading army. It's the committee that decides the archive budget can wait. It's not the iconoclasts with hammers. The slow decay of the format itself, whether it's papyrus turning to dust or a digital file that nothing can read anymore. That's where the old story connects to now. We have our own compounding catastrophes today. Digital archives aren't at risk from one hacker or one server crash. They're at risk from link rot, from software that no one supports, from companies that fail and take their data with them, from an institution just losing interest. A cultural site isn't lost just to a bomb. It's lost first to erosion, then to looting because of local poverty, then to political chaos that stops anyone from protecting it, then finally to conflict. The stages build. What Alexandria teaches is that preservation isn't something you do once, it's a continuous choice. A choice to fund, to copy, to migrate, to care, year after year, even when there seem to be more urgent things. When that chain of care breaks, even for just one generation, the loss is forever. The silence that comes after isn't dramatic. It's the quiet of an empty space on a shelf, a dead link, a question that has no answer left. Aristarchus of Samos, that was his name, a Greek astronomer in the 3rd century before the Common Era. He looked at the heavens and he made this leap, it all common sense. He proposed that the Earth was not the center. He said the Earth and the other planets, they revolved around the sun. He placed the sun at the center. This was. And he did this nearly 2,000 years before. We know about it, but we know because other writers mentioned him. Archimedes, others, they referenced his idea almost as a curiosity, a footnote. The library at Alexandria, it almost certainly held his original work. His calculations, his models, his reasoning on scrolls, that text is gone. What we have left is one surviving treatise of his, on the sizes and distances of the sun and moon. It's a brilliant work of geometry, but it cautiously assumes an Earth-centered universe. His radical book, the one that turned the cosmos inside out, that vanished. We only know its title. We only know it existed because someone else saw it on a shelf in Alexandria and wrote it down. That's the ghost in the archive, a title without a text, an idea whose proof was erased. And that's the haunting question, the what if? What if that scroll had been, for centuries? What if every generation of scholars in that library had grappled with his math, tested his observations, built on his insight? The tradition there was built for that. To take a radical idea and stress test it, through debate, through refinement. Could the long detour have been avoided, that view that dominated Western thought for over a millennium? Might the scientific revolution have bloomed earlier, in the Roman era or in Baghdad? instead of waiting for 16th century Europe. We can't know, that's the point. The loss of his work isn't just a missing book. It represents a collapsed bridge in time, a potential path for human thought that was washed away. A single gap in the record isn't a blank page. It's a locked door, and on the other side of that door might have been a different timeline. A timeline where we didn't spend 1800 years looking at the universe from the wrong starting point. That's the true cost. It's measured not in scrolls burned but in centuries lost. In questions asked too late, the scrolls were part of the problem. The medium itself was fragile. Papyrus is made from a water plant pressed into sheets. It's organic, it wants to go back to the earth. In a dry place like Egypt, it could last a long time, but it wasn't permanent. Dampness brought mold. Insects would eat the fibers. Even the air over decades made it brittle. Unrolling an old scroll without it crumbling was a delicate art. And fire, of course, would erase everything instantly. This wasn't like stone. Stone could be buried for thousands of years and still tell its story when you found it. A papyrus scroll left on a shelf had an expiration date. It was measured in generations, not ages. So the library's mission wasn't just to collect, it was to outrun decay. The only way to preserve a text long-term was to copy it by hand onto new papyrus before the old one turned to dust. That was a continuous process, labor-intensive. It needed a dedicated class of scribes funded forever who saw their work as a duty to the future. They weren't just clerks. They were like an immune system for civilization, fighting the entropy of time. When the political will faded, when the money dried up, the copying stopped. And when the copying stopped, the countdown began for every scroll in the collection. Not with a bang, but with a silent chemical process. A slow surrender. Think of it as a garden, a vast garden of rare flowers, but each flower only bloomed for a season. To keep the garden alive, you had to collect the seeds and plant them again year after year. If you stop tending it, even for a few seasons, the flowers die out. They don't scream, they just wither. The loss is absolute. That's what happened. The gardeners, the scholars, the scribes, the patrons, they left, or they were told to tend other gardens, and the unique blossoms of thought cultivated for centuries simply faded away, one by one. A unique history of Carthage gone, a treatise on steam mechanics by Hero of Alexandria surviving only in fragments elsewhere. A complete catalogue of Mediterranean plants and their uses vanished. This limitation forces a realization. The catastrophe of Alexandria was, in a real sense, a failure of information technology. The chosen medium for storing great ideas was inherently temporary. It needed a stable, wealthy, committed society to act as its permanent life support. When that society fractured or changed priorities, the support failed. The knowledge it was built to sustain couldn't survive on its own. And this is where those ancient whispers speak to our digital age. We face a parallel challenge. We've traded papyrus for pixels. Our archives are now server farms and cloud storage. It feels permanent, but is it? Digital data has its own fragility. It's called data rot. File formats become obsolete. The software to read a document from 20 years ago might not run on a modern computer. Companies that host our photos, our emails, can vanish overnight. Hard drives fail. Servers are decommissioned. A link that worked yesterday gives an error today. We're building a mountain of knowledge on a foundation that needs constant active maintenance. Just like the scribes of Alexandria, we need digital archivists, format migrators, system administrators working constantly to copy our data forward, to migrate it to new platforms, to keep it readable. When the funding for that stops or when the institutional will fades, our digital scrolls begin their own silent fade. Not into dust, but into gibberish, into unreadable code. The lesson in the crumbling papyrus is clear. Knowledge is only as durable as the society committed to its upkeep. The medium matters, but the commitment matters more. The fire and the decay, the politics, they all went after the physical archive. But the deeper wound was something you couldn't see. It was the scattering of the minds. The library was alive because of the people inside it. The philosophers, the astronomers, the poets. They didn't just work there. They lived there. They ate together. They walked the colonnades, arguing geometry or a line of poetry. They taught students who then taught others. That was a continuous chain, a living tradition. And when the institution crumbled, that chain broke. The scholars lost their workplace. They lost their community, their network. And without that, even the scrolls that survived lost their voice. Hypatia's story is the sharpest symbol of that break. Her death was a personal tragedy, but it was also a signal sent across the Mediterranean world. It told every other thinker in Alexandria that the environment had turned toxic. The space for open inquiry, for secular scholarship, for debate free from doctrine, that space was gone, so they left. The great dispersal began. Some went east to the schools in the Byzantine Empire. Others retired quietly, their work unfinished. A few may have hidden their texts and fled the city. The brain drain was complete. That scattering is a different kind of loss. It's the loss of context. Think of a master violin. It's a beautiful, complex instrument. But if you give it to someone who's never seen one, they won't know how to make it sing. They might not even know it can make sound. The scrolls were like that. They were instruments of thought. And the scholars were the musician. They knew how to play them. They knew the tuning, the techniques, the subtle references. They held the oral knowledge, the unwritten assumptions, the debates, the interpretations that gave the written words their full meaning. When that community dispersed, the music stopped. Even if a scroll survived, smuggled out to a monastery or a private collection, its full resonance was often lost. The commentary that explained its difficult passages gone. The rival theory it was arguing against forgotten. The next experimental step it suggested never taken. The text became a silent object, a curiosity. Its potential for sparking new ideas was extinguished because the human network needed to fan that spark was shattered. This is the social and intellectual diaspora. It's a catastrophe of connection. The library wasn't just a warehouse. It was a crossroads, a place where an idea from India could meet a method from Greece and produce something new. That crossroads was dismantled. The travelers were sent down separate roads, never to meet again. The collaborative spirit, that friction and synergy that accelerates discovery, it evaporated. So the true legacy of the fall isn't just a list of missing books. It's the silence that followed. The silence of questions no longer asked. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Intellectual lineages that ended with a generation of scholars who had nowhere left to go. The scrolls could burn or crumble. But the death of the community meant that even the ones that survived were, in a profound way, already lost. The scrolls didn't all vanish in one fire. That's a crucial point. To think everything was lost is to misunderstand how knowledge travels. It flows, it copies, it escapes. Even as the great library faded, its contents had already seeped out. Scholars traveling to Alexandria made copies to take home. Wealthy Romans, infatuated with Greek learning, built private libraries with scrolls bought or from the originals. Other centers of learning, like the library at Pergamum, held collections that overlapped with Alexandria's. And later, Byzantine monasteries and Islamic translation houses in Baghdad became the new guardians. They preserved Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Galen. They translated these works into Syriac, Arabic, Persian, and later, those translations made their way back into Latin Europe. The backbone of Greek philosophy and science survived through these other channels. So we're not standing in total darkness. The catastrophe wasn't absolute. But that fact leads to a more precise question, a more haunting one. If the core text survived elsewhere, what was actually lost in Alexandria? The answer is in what made that library unique. It wasn't just a collection of famous books. It was a complete archive. Imagine the difference between having a famous author's published novel and having access to that author's entire personal study. Their early drafts covered in scribbled notes, their research journals, letters debating ideas with rivals, obscure reference texts they consulted. That's what Alexandria held. It was the comprehensive depth. The library aimed for totality. It collected not just the great works but the minor ones, not just the final treatise but the earlier flawed versions that showed how the thinker's ideas evolved. It held the raw observations of Babylonian astronomers on their original clay tablets, translated into Greek. It held the personal notes of geographers, the multiple conflicting histories of the same event. The complete catalog of a playwright's works, not just the popular three. This is what vanished. The unique items, the singular copies of texts from cultures that later faded from history, the research compilations that existed nowhere else, the context that let you trace the lineage of an idea from its birth through its refinement to its final form. That context is irreplaceable. We have Euclid's Elements, but did the library hold his earlier failed attempts at those proofs? We have fragments of Sappho's poetry, but did it hold the complete volume of her songs? We know the names of historians who wrote entire chronicles of Phoenicia or the Etruscans, but their works are gone, likely lost when their only copies in Alexandria decayed. So the survival of the canonical works is a relief, but it's also a diversion. It lets us think the damage was minimal. In truth, the loss was of a different order. It was the loss of the network. The library was the central hub in a web of knowledge. When it fell, the most delicate strands in that web, the unique, the obscure, the experimental, were the first to snap and blow away. What remains for us is a skeleton. The major bones of Greek thought survived, but the connective tissue, the vast body of supporting material that gave that skeleton life and movement and nuance, that was largely obliterated. This sharpens the understanding. It moves us from a view of total blackout to a more sobering realization. We lost the depth of field. Our picture of the ancient world is in focus only on a few central figures. The periphery, the background, the rich and complicated landscape that surrounded them has faded into an indistinct blur. And in that blur, we have to imagine all the connections, the alternatives, the lost paths that we'll simply never see. The story doesn't just go straight to the Renaissance. There's this brilliant light in between. Centuries after Alexandria faded, a new center of learning rose, far to the east. In Baghdad, under the Abbasid Caliph, scholars built the the House of Wisdom. It became the new engine of thought. And these scholars, they knew the legacy they had inherited, a fractured one. They launched a monumental project to find every surviving scrap of Greek science and philosophy they could. In monasteries across the old Byzantine Empire, in Persian archives, in markets from Damascus to Cairo, they gathered these texts and translated them into Arabic. This wasn't just collecting, it was a rescue mission. They saved the works of Aristotle, Plato, Ptolemy, Galen, Euclid. They saved them from being lost. But there's a quiet tragedy inside that triumph. They were working with a filtered set of texts, a subset. They were piecing together a mosaic, but they knew, from references in the texts they did have, that many of the original pieces were missing. They had Aristotle's physics, but did they have all the works of his predecessors that he argued against? They had Ptolemy's models, but did they have the competing theories of Aristarchus? Theories that might have challenged the Earth-centered system more directly. The scholars in Baghdad were geniuses. They synthesized, they innovated. Al revolutionized mathematics. Al founded the modern science of optics. Their work was staggering, but it was built on a foundation that had already been narrowed by the loss at Alexandria. They were running a relay, but the baton had been snapped in half long before it reached their hands. So you have to ask a question, a speculative one. How different would science have been from the 9th to the 13th centuries if the House of Wisdom had received the full transmission? Not just the great canonical texts, but the complete archive. The raw data, the failed experiments, the obscure treatises, the competing schools of thought that the Library of Alexandria once held. Would discovery have accelerated? Would dead ends that consumed generations have been avoided? Could the blend of Greek logic with Indian mathematics and Persian observation have produced an even earlier scientific revolution? We can't know. But the legacy of that loss is written into the structure of the Islamic Golden Age's scholarship. It was a golden age built on salvaged fragments, and that shaped everything that came after. Because when these Arabic translations, now enriched with centuries of new commentary and discovery, made their way into medieval Europe, translated into Latin in Sicily, they ignited the European Renaissance. That rebirth was fueled by a stream of knowledge that had passed through a bottleneck. A bottleneck created centuries earlier, when the library's comprehensive vision dissolved. The echo of Alexandria's silence resonated through Baghdad and into the lecture halls of Oxford and Paris. It reminds you that the chains of knowledge are long. A break in one link weakens every link that follows. For 1,000 years, the Library of Alexandria, that's the name. But what we talk about now, it's not really the building, it's something else. It's become this symbol, a symbol of loss. When you hear the name, you're not thinking of a place in Egypt, you're thinking of ancient wisdom. And how fragile it was. It touches this fear, the fear of forgetting who we are, and that might be its real legacy, this permanent warning. Poets have used it for centuries, novelists, it's the perfect metaphor for the price of war, for intolerance. For when a society's lights go out one by one, in stories it's this lost utopia, where every question had an answer, until those answers were just scattered. Filmmakers show it burning, and it means the end of an age of reason. These stories, they're not about history, they're about a feeling, a shared anxiety, that everything we build, everything we know, it's all on the edge of a cliff. And this symbol, it exists because the story is incomplete, it's shrouded in mystery, conflicting tales, that leaves a space, a vacuum, and we fill it with our own fears. Today with digital data, it's a warning about the cloud, about how fragile that is. In a polarized time, it's a lesson, how ideology can shrink the world of ideas. Its ghost is there, in talks about defunding universities, or cutting the arts, or letting public archives decay. The fact we're still telling this story, piecing it together centuries later, that proves something. The physical destruction wasn't the end, it was the start of a myth, a story we tell to make the value of knowledge concrete, to give a face to that void. The void that opens when a culture neglects its memory. We keep it alive in our imagination, not just to mourn what was lost, but to underscore what we still have. And what we might lose, it's a perpetual reminder. One name that carries the weight of all vanished libraries, all burned books, all silenced ideas. When we say Alexandria, we're not just speaking of the past, we're expressing a hope and a fear about the future, the hope that we're wiser now, the fear that we're still on that same cliff, looking out at the same sea, making the same small, quiet choices that lead to a great forgetting. Our digital age still faces that old silence. We've built a new Alexandria, but it's made of light, of electricity. Every email, every digital photo, every research paper, every government record. They exist as patterns of ones and zeros on a hard drive on a distant server. It feels permanent, weightless, infinite. But that permanence is an illusion. It rests on a fragile, invisible infrastructure. A single powerful solar flare, a coronal mass ejection, could send an electromagnetic pulse through our atmosphere. It could fry satellites, overload power grids. In an instant, the global network that holds our collective memory could go dark. Data centers without power, their delicate electronics scrambled, they'd become silent mausoleums, full of unreadable information. That's a physical vulnerability, a modern version of a library's vulnerability to fire. Then there's the slow decay, the digital equivalent of papyrus turning to dust. It's called format obsolescence. Think of the floppy disk. A standard tool just 30 years ago. Today, finding a drive that can read one is a challenge for a specialist. The software on that disk, the word processor file, it might as well be an ancient, undeciphered script. Now multiply that across every changing file format: documents, videos, proprietary databases. The software to open them gets updated, replaced, abandoned by companies that cease to exist. Without constant, active migration of data to new formats, our digital scrolls get locked in digital tombs. We can see they're there, but we can't access the contents. That's neglect by technological evolution. And there's the human factor, the political and corporate will. A digital archive isn't free. It requires money. For servers, for cooling systems, for teams of experts to maintain and migrate the data. When a university faces budget cuts, what's the first department to see reductions? Often it's the library, the archives. When a social media company goes bankrupt, what happens to the billions of photographs, the personal histories stored on its servers? They can be deleted, sold off, left to decay in a legal limbo. That's the modern face of the funding crisis that starved the scribes of Alexandria. It's a quiet decision, made in a boardroom or a legislative session. A decision that severs the chain of care for a generation's worth of knowledge. The lesson from the ancient catastrophe isn't to centralize everything in one digital fortress. That would repeat the original mistake, creating a single point of catastrophic failure. The lesson is in redundancy and diversity. It means multiple copies, stored in multiple formats in multiple geographic locations. It means maintaining physical analog backups of our most vital knowledge, printed on archival paper, etched onto durable metal plates, stored in secure vaults. It means open-source file formats that aren't owned by any one corporation. So the keys to our knowledge aren't held by a single entity that could fail or change its priorities. Most importantly, the lesson is cultural. It's about fostering a society-wide ethic of preservation, one that sees the maintenance of our digital memory not as a technical cost, but as a duty. The librarians of Alexandria understood that duty. They fought against entropy with pen and ink. Our fight is against bit rot and corporate amnesia. The framework is the same. The ancient whispers tell us that knowledge survives only when a community is committed, generation after generation, to its active defense. Our new library is vast beyond imagining, but its foundations are just as vulnerable to the same old enemies: complacency, shifting priorities, and the mistaken belief that something built to last will simply take care of itself. Archaeology gives us another kind of record, one that's written in stone and also in the places where stone is missing. Looking for the physical library means digging through layers of time. Today's Alexandria is a living city, built right on top of the ancient one. So excavation has to be careful, like surgery, in small spaces between modern buildings and streets. They haven't found a grand building with a sign, with shelves knocked over and burned scrolls. That kind of dramatic find hasn't happened, but the ground has offered other things. In digs around what was probably the royal quarter, they've found structures that point to a life of learning. There are lecture halls, big rooms with stepped seating, built for an audience to come and listen. They've found inscriptions praising scholars and poets. Pieces of papyrus turn up, not necessarily from the library itself, but showing writing was everywhere. And they've located the site of its foundations show the size of that great temple complex, which later became a church. The stones tell a story of change, one order replacing another. But importantly, in all these layers, there isn't one big burn layer. No thick line of ash and charcoal that would mean a sudden fiery end for a huge collection of papyrus. That silence from the dirt is really important. It backs up the idea of a slow fading. The physical evidence says the institution didn't end in a blaze. It points to it being taken apart, reused, and then forgot. The buildings might have stood for centuries, used for other things, even as the scrolls inside were neglected or moved or just crumbled. This archaeological view confirms the most haunting part of the loss. The catastrophe wasn't really about buildings. It was about the institution. It was about a purpose vanishing. The stones of a lecture hall can last long after the last lecture. A library's foundation can remain long after the last book has turned to dust or been taken away. The real tragedy left few dramatic traces because it was a tragedy of emptiness. Rooms that once had debate just went quiet. Shelves weren't violently smashed, they just weren't filled again. So the Earth story is subtle. It tells us to look for loss not in ruins but in empty spaces, not in what was broken but in what was left behind. The library, as a living center, probably just dissolved back into the city. Its physical form was absorbed, its materials reused. That's what makes the search so hard and the lesson so clear. The biggest disappearances in history often leave the mark. They're erasures, not explosions. And an erasure is much harder to find and in some ways much more unsettling to think about. The texts that survived, they still faced a quieter danger. They had to be by hand century after century. It was a necessity, but it was also a vulnerability. Every time a scribe sat down to copy, the potential for error was there. A moment of fatigue, a misread word, a skipped line, simple human mistakes. But across dozens of copies over hundreds of years, those small errors could compound. They could change the meaning of a passage in a medical text, alter a number in an astronomical calculation, and the scribe might not even know they were copying an error from an earlier version. That mistake would then be faithfully reproduced by the next scribe. It would become part of the tradition. This was the slow corruption of knowledge. A signal degrading as it traveled through time. And the Library of Alexandria was meant to be the signal's source. Its mission was to hold the original, the version. Scholars could compare copies against the master text in the library's collection. They could correct errors, restore omissions. It was a quality control system for civilization's memory. When that central archive faded, that function vanished. The texts that survived did so through scattered, independent chains of copies. A philosophical work might be preserved in a monastery in Ireland, from a version that passed through Rome and Constantinople. A scientific treatise might survive in an Arabic translation, from a Syriac version, which was itself a copy of a Greek original smuggled out of Alexandria. At every stage, in every scriptorium, the text was at the mercy of the scribe's skill, attention, and sometimes their own beliefs. Intentional alterations happened too. A Christian scribe copying a pagan text might subtly change a passage to align with church doctrine, thinking he was correcting an error. A translator, faced with a difficult concept, might choose a word that approximated the idea but shifted its meaning. These weren't acts of vandalism. They were often acts of care, of trying to make sense of a complex inheritance, but the effect was the same. The original voice of the author grew fainter, layered under generations of interpretation and accidental change. So for some of the works we have today, we aren't reading the version that sat on a shelf in Alexandria. We are reading a distant echo, a text shaped and reshaped by its journey through a fractured landscape. We have Aristotle, but is it precisely the Aristotle the librarians there curated? We have Euclid's geometry, but does every diagram match the one in the master scroll? We can't be entirely sure. The catastrophe enabled this silent, incremental transformation. It wasn't just the loss of texts, it was the loss of fidelity, the assurance that the knowledge passed down was the knowledge originally recorded. This is a more subtle but equally profound dimension of the disaster. It means that even in our possession, some of the recovered light from the ancient world is refracted, filtered through the prism of 1,000 hands, each leaving their own tiny, imperceptible mark. Power understood what information was worth. A library in the ancient world wasn't just a building, it was an institution, and institutions can become rivals. Alexandria had this independent scholarly tradition. Kings funded it, but it operated with its own intellectual freedom. That was a kind of authority outside the state, a place where ideas got debated, ideas that might challenge a ruler's legitimacy or question the official history, or propose a different model for society entirely. To a political faction in Rome or later in Constantinople, that kind of independence starts to look less like an asset, more like a liability, a potential center of dissent. So the slow neglect, could that have been a quiet policy? Not an order to burn it, a decision to defund it, to stop feeding the thing you can't fully control. If you centralize education, bring the scholars under imperial patronage in your own capital, you channel their work. You align it with state interests. The Great Dispersal from Alexandria, that wasn't just a funding tragedy. From this angle, it was a consolidation, gathering intellectual capital into hands that could direct it. Letting the old library fade removed an alternative pole of influence. It the whole landscape of ideas. Then there's the blunt arithmetic, the resources. Maintaining was phenomenally expensive. The stipends for dozens of leading scholars, salaries for hundreds of scribes and catalogers and maintenance staff, the constant purchase of papyrus and ink, the construction and upkeep of the grand campus itself, to a practical-minded emperor facing barbarian threats on the frontier, or a city prefect dealing with grain shortages and unrest. That river of gold flowing into the library quarter must have seemed like a luxury, an extravagant one. The calculation gets coldly logical. What does that investment return? It produces philosophical debates, star charts, poetry, worthy pursuits maybe. But an army returns territory, an aqueduct returns public health and political loyalty, a distribution of grain returns civic peace. In that relentless competition for state funds, cultural prestige often loses. It loses to immediate tangible needs or perceived needs. The library's budget didn't vanish in a single vote. It was chipped away year after year, reallocated to projects with more visible outcomes, more politically useful outcomes. This wasn't malice. It was prioritization, a series of administrative choices that, over generations, amounted to a death sentence. That reframes the whole catastrophe. It moves it from tragic accident into political economy. The loss of the library might not have been a side effect of chaos. It might have been the outcome of stability, a stable, functioning state making rational, short-term decisions about where to spend its money, about how to manage intellectual dissent. They chose armies over archivists. They chose aqueducts over astronomers. They chose a manageable, centralized intellectual culture over a vibrant, independent, unpredictable one. That might be the most unsettling interpretation. It suggests the greatest threats to our collective memory aren't always the fires of war or the fervor of zealots. Sometimes the threat is a balanced budget, a 5-year plan, a committee meeting where the case for preserving the obscure and the complex is quietly set aside in favor of the urgent and the pragmatic. The librarians of Alexandria were stewards of the long now. The politicians and accountants who slowly cut their funding were managers of the immediate present. The catastrophe was the collision of those two, and in that collision, the future always loses. The anxiety about permanence is deep in our cultural memory. We have this inherited story about history, where golden ages are always followed by dark ones. The Library of Alexandria is a cornerstone of that story. It tells us brilliance is fragile. Progress isn't a straight line. It's a flickering light, one that can be snuffed out by conflict, by neglect, by the turning of a page. This idea has shaped the Western mindset. It creates a background hum of worry, a sense that any achievement, no matter how grand, is temporary, that our own age of information might just be another chapter in a cycle of creation and ruin. This isn't just an academic thought. It's a psychological framework. Influences how we view our own place in time. Think of the term Dark Ages. For centuries, it described the period in Europe after the fall of Rome, a time when the light of classical learning preserved in places like Alexandria had supposedly gone out. That label carries an emotional weight. It implies a loss of reason, a step backward into shadow. The burning library became the perfect symbol for that transition. It gave a single catastrophic event to point to, a reason for the darkness. This framework makes history feel like a relay race where the baton was dropped. It fosters a sense of tragic interruption, that we spent centuries trying to recover what was once known. This perspective isn't necessarily wrong, but it is powerfully shaped by the story of the loss. It makes us view the past through a lens of fragility. This psychological legacy produces two powerful opposing drives. On one hand, it can inspire a fierce, almost desperate determination to preserve. It's the fuel behind massive digitization projects, the seed vaults in the Arctic, the work of archivists. It's the voice that says, never again. We build backups of our backups because we've internalized the lesson of the single, vulnerable repository. We are haunted by the ghost of those scrolls turning to dust. That haunting makes us vigilant. On the other hand, the same story can breed a kind of cultural pessimism, a quiet expectation that loss is inevitable, that every library will eventually burn. This can lead to a focus on salvaging and mourning what's gone, rather than a boundless optimism about what can be built. For scholars, it's a sobering reminder. Their life's work, the papers, the data, the theories, all rest on an unstable foundation. A foundation of funding, of institutional support, of technological continuity. One shift in the political wind, one change in budget priorities, and a lifetime of research can become inaccessible. It's a foundational trauma for the very concept of scholarship. The work exists not in a vacuum, but in a world that can forget it. This is why the mystery of Alexandria remains so potent. We revisit it in books, in films, in documentaries, not just to solve a historical puzzle. We revisit it to grapple with our own anxieties. The story is a mirror. It reflects our deepest fears about the durability of our own civilization. When we ask what happened to the library, we're also asking a much more personal question. What will remain of us? What threads of our own knowledge will snap and which will hold? The library's fate tells us that preservation is not passive. It is a conscious, continuous, and fragile act. And that realization, born from an ancient catastrophe, is what keeps the story alive. It's no longer just about scrolls in Alexandria. It's about every idea we've ever dared to write down, and the quiet hope that it might outlast the moment of its creation. That shadow world is a haunting place. If the library had stood for another 1,000 years, our timeline would be different. Picture a scholar in the year 1200, but in Alexandria, in a sunlit room. He has Aristotle, but also the complete works of Aristarchus, which put the sun at the center. He has the original diagrams from Hero of Alexandria, who built a primitive steam engine. He has medical texts from India, with surgical procedures Europe didn't know. That continuous study would have changed the rhythm of discovery. The Renaissance was a reawakening, but it was a salvage operation. Scholars were piecing together a puzzle with half the pieces gone. What if, instead of a rediscovery, it had been an acceleration? If the full body of Greek science had never been lost, building on it could have started centuries earlier. The Babylonian astronomical records held there, combined with Greek geometry and Indian numerals, they might have produced a precise model of the solar system by the year 1000. The concept of experimental method, hinted at in some texts, might have been formalized long before the 17th century. Medicine is one of the starkest what-ifs. The library held the works of Herophilus, who did detailed anatomical studies. That line of inquiry based on observation was abandoned for over 1,000 years. If his methods had remained central to medical education, how many lives might have been saved? Progress on contagion, surgery, pharmacology, it could have advanced on a faster curve. This also changes the geography of progress. The library was a global archive. Its survival would have meant the continuous integration of knowledge from Persian, Indian, Egyptian, Mesopotamian sources into the mainstream. The development of mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, it wouldn't have been so narrowly channeled through a later, filtered pipeline. It might have been a truly multicultural endeavor from the start. The history of science might feel less like a westward march and more like a collaborative network. The term Western civilization might carry a different, more inclusive meaning. This isn't fantasy. It's a way to measure the true cost. Economists talk about opportunity cost, the value of the path not taken. The void left by Alexandria is an immense opportunity cost for our species. It's a cost in time measured in centuries of stagnation. It's a cost in diversity measured in the silencing of entire schools of thought. And most hauntingly, it's a cost in questions never asked. Each lost scroll was a set of hypotheses, a different way of seeing. Without them, generations of thinkers weren't even aware of the problems they could have been solving. They were working in a room with most of the lights off, unaware of the doors lining the walls. The shadow world is one where those doors remained open, where the conversation never stopped. And glimpsing that possibility sharpens our understanding of what was truly lost, not in the past, but in all the futures that never came to be. The memory of that fire in Alexandria, it's still there. In how we handle information now. The whole field of library science, archive science, it's built on that event. It turned that history into rules, into practice. The first rule is decentralization. You can't have everything in one place, not again. So now the important works, they aren't kept in one building. They're scattered. A manuscript gets digitized and that file goes onto servers in different countries, different continents. Physical copies go into vaults. In the Arctic underground, in national libraries far apart. That's the professional response. To protect something, you have to let it travel. You have to let it exist in many places at once. That leads to the second idea, format migration. The old scribes, they text from decaying papyrus to new scrolls. Now archivists migrate data. They move it from old tapes to new formats. They make sure a document from the 90s can still be open today. It's a constant process, not glamorous, but vital. It admits that all media has a papyrus silicon, it all decays. Preservation isn't a one-time save. It's a permanent commitment to renewal. These efforts, they rely on international cooperation. A rejection of the isolation that helped cause the ancient loss. Programs like UNESCO's Memory of the World, they identify and digitize heritage from every culture. They build a global network. A medieval manuscript from Timbuktu, audio archives from a Pacific island, film from a vanished studio, these aren't just national treasures. They're threads in a shared story. Protecting them is a collective responsibility. Alexandria showed that. When knowledge belongs to one power, its survival is tied to that power's fate. Underneath all this is a lesson about funding, about guardianship. Modern preservation argues for stable, apolitical funding for cultural institutions. The slow starvation of the taught that when archives compete with immediate political or military needs, they lose. Their value is long-term, invisible in quarterly reports or election cycles. Securing their future means endowments, legal mandates, a public consensus that this work is essential infrastructure. Not for a city, but for civilization. And at the center are the librarians and archivists. The catastrophe changed their role. They're not passive curators anymore. They're active guardians, first responders against entropy. They run the migration plans, they manage the distributed networks, they make the daily choices about what to save and how. They hold the line against the quiet decay that took the scrolls. Every time they digitize a crumbling newspaper, back up a server, store a film negative in a salt mine, they're applying the ancient lesson. Making sure no single disaster, no shift in politics, no simple neglect can ever erase a chapter of who we are again. The library's silence taught us how to listen for the faintest signals from the past, and how to make sure they keep speaking. We want clear villains in stories of loss. A single fire, a single tyrant, it gives the story an ending, a moral. The Library of Alexandria and how we imagine it has been given all of these. You see Julius Caesar watching the flames, or a Christian crowd smashing things in the, or Caliph ordering the scrolls burned for fuel. These are powerful images. They give a face to the catastrophe, but they're myths, compelling, dramatic, and wrong. Looking across the centuries shows something more unsettling. The library didn't die from a single sword thrust. It was a slow, complex illness, a mix of human decisions, material failure, shifting ideas over hundreds of years. That's the messy reality. And taking apart the simple myth, it's not just academic, it's essential, because it changes how we see the loss itself. If you blame Caesar, you ignore centuries of Roman neglect that came after. Blame a religious mob, you overlook the slow ideological shift that made that act possible. Blame Caliph, you miss that the library as an institution had already vanished centuries before his army arrived. These simple stories are a kind of compression. They take a sprawling process, the decline of an institution over 600 years, and squeeze it into one dramatic scene. It makes the past easier to digest. A clean narrative, a beginning, middle, and end. But in doing that, it steals the real lesson. The lesson is in the complexity. The real catastrophe wasn't a moment. It was a chain. Each link enabled the next. Political ambition built it. Accidental war damaged its edges. Administrative neglect starved its upkeep. A changing religious and intellectual climate froze its spirit. State-sanctioned destruction removed its last symbolic bastion. And then, the simple entropy of time turned what was left to dust. No single one of these forces was enough on its own, but together, in sequence, they formed a perfect storm. That's the sobering truth. Civilizations aren't usually murdered. They often fade. They unravel. They forget themselves through 1,000 small, quiet choices. By separating the myth from the reality, we don't make the loss smaller. We understand it more deeply. We move from mourning a building that burned to mourning a system that failed. A system of funding, of copying, of scholarly community, of tolerance. That system dissolved. Replacing the simple fire story with this multifaceted one gives us a better tool. It's a lens for looking at our own world. What are our compounding vulnerabilities? Where are the slow leaks? What institutions are we starving through benign neglect or undermining through polarized ideas without even seeing the pattern? The demystification of Alexandria is the final key. It unlocks the mystery not by giving a simple answer, but by showing the question was too simple. The library's fate whispers that the greatest threats to our memory are rarely the dramatic fires we watch for. They are the slow drafts we ignore, the quiet decisions in committee rooms, the shifting of priorities we call temporary. Understanding that that's the true legacy of the silence in those empty halls, the catastrophe was a process. It was a slow unraveling. Ambition, care, memory, it all came apart. We started with a king's dream to gather all the world's knowledge in one place. And then we saw the long dissolution, the accidental fires, the slow starvation of funds, a chilling shift in ideology, and then the final scattering of a whole community of minds. The library's story is really the story of how civilizations forget. It's a map of vulnerability, and the map shows the greatest threats aren't sudden invasions. They're the gradual reallocation of attention, the quiet decision that preservation can wait. Carl Sagan looked back and called it a devastating blow. He imagined that other timeline where the scrolls survived. A colossal amount of information just gone. We lost answers. And we lost the questions we no longer knew to ask. We lost potential paths. The ghost of Aristarchus with his sun-centered cosmos waiting in silence for 1,000 years, that's just one emblem of that stolen future. So what do we take from this? A warning, sure, but also a call. A call to recognize our memory isn't a vault, it's a garden. It needs constant active tending. It needs scribes in every age who see copying and renewing as a sacred duty. It needs societies that value their archives, their libraries, not as luxuries but as essential infrastructure. The bedrock of who we are. This story doesn't end with an answer. It ends with a responsibility passed to us. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but its lesson is etched into every digital server, every university hall, every community bookshelf. It whispers that preservation is a choice we make every day, to fund, to care, to look beyond the immediate and defend those fragile threads, the threads that connect us to our past and to each other.